My father turned 60 on a Saturday in October, and I drove 40 minutes through rain to sit at a table where no one had saved me a seat. That's the short version. The longer one starts years before, with a life insurance policy my mother left behind for me, a restaurant my stepbrother opened with money that wasn't his to spend, and every single time I walked into a room full of people who shared my last name and still felt completely alone. But that October Saturday was the last time I made that drive. The last time I let hope cost me anything. I arrived 7 minutes late. Not on purpose. Just genuinely late because I'd sat in the parking garage for 5 minutes trying to convince myself to go in. The banquet hall my stepmother had rented was the kind of place that tries very hard to look expensive. Cream tablecloths, fake orchids, a monogrammed photo backdrop that said 60 and celebrated in gold balloon letters. My stepmother met me near the entrance. Her smile arrived before the rest of her face did. "There she is," she said, arms open wide. "We were starting to think you weren't coming." I let her hug me. She smelled like the same perfume she'd worn for 20 years. Something floral and aggressive, like it was trying to win an argument. "Traffic," I said. "The rain." "Of course." She was already looking past me. My stepbrother was across the room holding a champagne flute and telling a story that had 3 people laughing. He was 2 years younger than me, broad-shouldered, easy in a room the way I never was. He saw me and raised his glass, like we were old college friends. I gave him a small nod. That was all either of us had for each other anymore. My half-sister, my father's daughter with my stepmother, was near the dessert table, talking to someone I didn't recognize. She caught my eye and waved. Warm enough, I suppose. She was 22. She hadn't done anything wrong, exactly. But she'd never done anything right either. And by that age, I'd stopped distinguishing between the two. My father was at the center of the room in the way only my father could manage. Not performing, not announcing himself, just somehow the gravitational point everyone else orbited. When he saw me, he smiled. He always smiled. That was the thing about my father. He was never cruel with his face. "Hey, sweetheart." He hugged me, and for 3 seconds, it felt like being 12 again. Then he turned back to his conversation, and I was just standing there holding my own coat. I found an empty chair at the end of the head table. No place card. The people on either side were a couple I'd met once at a Christmas party, and they were deep in conversation about property taxes. I took a glass of water from a passing server and pretended to study the centerpiece. The toast happened before dinner. My stepmother stood, clinked her champagne flute, and waited for the room to quiet. She was good at this: events, ceremonies, the architecture of a moment. She'd been planning this party for months. I knew because she'd mentioned it every time we spoke, which wasn't often. 60 years, she began, and the room smiled. 60 years of this man who makes every room better simply by walking into it. My father looked at the table the way men do when they're pleased, but pretending not to be. She talked about resilience, about the family they'd built together. She listed her children by name, my stepbrother's restaurant, my half-sister's college graduation last spring, her own volunteer work at the hospital auxiliary. Then she paused, tilted her head slightly, and said, "And to those of us still finding our footing, we see you too, and we wish you well." A ripple of polite laughter moved around the room. I didn't flinch. I'd had practice. But I felt it, that particular humiliation that comes dressed as goodwill. That phrasing, "still finding your footing," aimed at the 31-year-old woman sitting at the end of the table who had a master's degree, a full-time job as a nurse practitioner, and a 1-bedroom apartment she paid for entirely herself, still finding my footing, like I was a toddler on ice skates. My father cleared his throat and said something about dinner, and everyone reached for their forks. And just like that, it was over. Later, after the salads were cleared, came the slideshow. My stepbrother had put it together, or paid someone to. 60 years of my father's life, set to a soft acoustic song I didn't recognize. Photos faded in and out on a screen at the front of the room. My father in his 20s with big hair and a bigger smile. My stepmother in a white sundress at some backyard party. My stepbrother as a baby, as a toddler, in a baseball uniform, at his college graduation, at the ribbon cutting for his restaurant. My half-sister's first steps, A beach vacation. A Christmas morning. I watched the whole thing. There were exactly 2 photos that included me. One from when I was maybe 8, standing at the edge of a group shot at some family reunion, half cut off by the frame. One from a holiday dinner, years later, blurry, in the background, looking at something off camera. That was it. 31 years, 2 photos. A child at the table in front of me, someone's kid, maybe 5 or 6, pointed at the screen during one of the group shots and whispered to her mother, "Who's that lady in the back?" Her mother shushed her. I looked down at my plate. The thing is, I knew they hadn't forgotten. That was what made it worse. Forgetting is accidental. This was tidy, precise. Someone had gone through decades of photographs, looked at every image that included me, and made a choice. I excused myself and found the restroom. Locked the single stall door. Looked at myself in the mirror under the buzzing fluorescent light. I didn't cry. I was past crying about this. What I felt was something quieter and more permanent, like a door closing from the inside. I thought about my mother. She died when I was 19. A car accident on a wet highway, the kind that happens in under 3 seconds and changes everything for decades. She'd had a life insurance policy, not enormous, but enough. Enough to cover the rest of my nursing school tuition, and maybe a little left over. At least, that was what my father told me it was for. He was in charge of the estate. I was 19 and grieving, and I trusted him. 2 years later, my stepbrother opened a restaurant. I found out about the insurance money 4 years after that, when I was digging through paperwork, trying to refinance student loans. I called my father. His voice went careful and measured the way it always did when he was managing me, rather than talking to me. The money needed to go somewhere useful, he said. Your brother had an opportunity. You were doing fine. I was doing fine. I was working 30 hours a week, on top of a full course load, and taking out private loans at 8% interest. But I was doing fine. I said okay and hung up the phone, and didn't bring it up again for 6 years. That was my mistake, not the anger, the silence. I went back to the party. My stepbrother had loosened his tie. He was telling a story about a supplier who'd tried to overcharge him. He told it like a war story, full of gestures and triumph. He caught me watching and looked at my mostly full plate. Not hungry, he asked, or just not a fan of the venue? I'm fine, I said. She's always fine. He said it to the table, not to me, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere useful. Most self-sufficient person I know. Never needs anything from anyone. A few polite chuckles. I picked up my fork. My hand was steady even when my chest wasn't. That night, driving home through the same rain I'd driven through to get there, I finally let myself think the thing I'd been avoiding for years. It wasn't going to change. Not the toasts, not the slideshows, not the small targeted comments dressed as jokes. My stepmother would keep smiling. My stepbrother would keep performing. My father would keep clearing his throat and moving on. And I would keep showing up. And they would keep not seeing me. I wasn't angry. I was done. The next morning I texted my mother's best friend. She and my mother had known each other since nursing school, 30-some years ago. When my mother died, she'd been at the funeral, one of the few people who held my hand and didn't tell me everything happens for a reason. We'd stayed loosely in touch. Birthday texts, occasional lunches. I'd always liked her. She was the kind of person who paid attention. Her reply came within the hour. I was wondering when you'd reach out. Come whenever. I have things I should have shown you a long time ago. I drove to her house on a Tuesday. She lived in a small craftsman bungalow with a big front porch and mismatched wind chimes. She opened the door before I knocked. Inside, her living room was cluttered in the way that feels like warmth instead of mess. Books stacked everywhere, photos on every surface, a cat sleeping on the radiator. She made tea without asking if I wanted any, and I sat at her kitchen table while she went to her study and came back carrying a plastic file box. I kept everything, she said, because your mother asked me to. Inside the box, a copy of the original insurance policy, with my name listed as the sole beneficiary. Bank statements from an account I'd never seen, showing the full amount deposited, and then withdrawn, in 2 large transfers, 2 months after my mother's funeral. Emails between my stepmother and my father, discussing the reallocation of the funds toward the restaurant's startup costs. And a handwritten note in my mother's handwriting, attached to a separate envelope. For her education. Not for anything else. Please make sure. I held that note for a long time. She knew, I said. She was worried. My mother's best friend wrapped both hands around her mug. She knew your father loved you. But she also knew how things worked in that house. She asked me to keep copies of everything, just in case. A pause. I should have given these to you sooner. I kept thinking, maybe they'd do right by you eventually. They didn't. No, she said quietly, they didn't. I drove home and spread everything across my kitchen table. Policy, bank records, emails, note. I looked at them for a long time. Then I called my attorney. She was a family law attorney I'd worked with briefly in a professional capacity. Sharp, direct, no wasted words. When I emailed the scanned documents, she called back within the hour. This isn't complicated, she said. This is fraud. The question is what you want to do with it. I want the truth on record, I said. I want it somewhere people can find it. You might get some of the money back regardless. Then that's fine too. 3 days later, I sent one email. Subject line: something you should know. I sent it to every blood relative who'd been at that party, every aunt, uncle, cousin, family friend who'd sat through that slideshow and applauded. Attached were 4 files, the insurance policy with my name on it, the bank transfer records, the emails, and a scan of my mother's handwritten note. I didn't write a single word of explanation. The documents spoke for themselves. My phone started ringing within 20 minutes. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. An aunt who said she'd always had a feeling. A family friend who kept saying, I had no idea, in a voice that suggested she probably had some. I didn't answer any of them. I let everything go to voicemail and stood at my window watching the street. My father didn't call. He sent a text. We need to talk about this privately. I didn't respond. My stepmother sent a carefully worded email. The gist. This was a family matter. I was airing grievances that had been resolved years ago. I was causing harm to people who loved me. She used the word healing 3 times. She did not use the word sorry once. My stepbrother went silent. No texts, no calls, nothing. Total blackout, which told me everything. Guilty people go quiet. Innocent people get loud. My half-sister texted 2 days later. I didn't know about the money. I swear. I believed her. She'd been a child when it happened. But I also thought about all the small moments where she'd seen how I was treated and stayed quiet anyway. About the slideshow she'd watched without a word. About still finding your footing. And the laughter that followed. I texted back, you should figure out who you want to be. In this family and outside of it. She didn't respond for a while. Then, I always thought you were the bravest person I knew. I wasn't brave, I wrote. I was just eventually out of other options. 2 weeks later, my attorney called with an update. A formal complaint had been filed. Given the documentation, there was a strong case for misappropriation of estate funds. And separately, completely separately, the county health department had received an anonymous tip about certain code violations at my stepbrother's restaurant. I didn't know anything about that. But I didn't lose sleep over it either. Within the week, the restaurant had closed temporarily for renovations. My stepbrother's business accounts went private. His LinkedIn went dark. My father finally called. I picked up on the 4th ring. He didn't say hello. He said, "What have you done?" Not a question. The same tone he'd used when I was 16 and got a B on a chemistry exam. Disappointment dressed as calm. I put the truth where people could find it, I said. That was private. That was family. I know. I'm the one who got left out of it. A long silence. We did what we thought was best, he said finally, for the whole family. I was part of the family. He cleared his throat. Classic. His tell. The throat clear before he changed the subject, but this time there was nowhere to change it to. He just cleared his throat and then there was nothing. 2 people on opposite ends of a phone that had run out of things to say. I have to go, I said. I hung up. Not triumphant, just finished. Like I'd finally stopped holding my breath after 31 years. A letter from his attorney arrived a week later. carefully worded. The gist: given the current misunderstandings, it might be best if I stepped back from family events for the foreseeable future. I read it twice. Then I wrote one sentence on a piece of notebook paper and mailed it back. I stopped attending a long time ago. You just didn't notice. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, I had people over for dinner. Not a party. Just dinner. My apartment was too small for anything you could call a party. I made a big pot of chicken and white bean soup and bought 2 loaves of sourdough from the bakery down the street. My mother's best friend came and brought homemade apple cake and spent the first 10 minutes trying to keep my cat away from it. A colleague from work, a physician assistant named Val, who made me laugh regularly and never once asked me to justify my feelings, came with a bottle of wine and a story about a raccoon that had tried to get into her car. A neighbor I'd grown close to over the past year brought her teenage daughter and a bag of clementines. We sat around my kitchen table. We ate and talked about bad television and running injuries, and whether the new coffee place on the corner was actually better than the old one. Nobody made a toast. Nobody gave a speech. Nobody called anyone ungrateful, or reminded anyone they were still finding their footing. At some point, I looked around the table and thought, this is it. This is what it's supposed to feel like. Not perfect. Not a performance. Just people actually present, actually there. After everyone left, I washed the dishes and sat on my couch for a long time in the quiet. My apartment was small and drafty, and the radiator made a sound like someone complaining softly to no one. I loved it. I had chosen every single thing in it. The next morning I drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried. I didn't bring flowers. I brought a letter I'd written at the kitchen table after the dishes were done. I sat in the wet grass and read it out loud. I told her about the policy. I told her I knew now what she'd tried to do. I told her that her best friend had been keeping watch for 12 years and that she'd chosen well in that friendship. I told her about the soup, the apple cake, the raccoon story. I told her the restaurant was closed. I told her I was okay, more than okay. The wind moved through the trees above me and knocked a leaf loose. It landed on my knee, and I left it there. On the drive home, my stepmother called. I declined. She called again. I declined again. Then a voicemail, her voice stripped of all that careful sweetness. You've caused a great deal of damage to people who did nothing but try to include you in this family. I hope you're satisfied. Include me, that word. I saved the voicemail for the legal file. Then I put my phone face down on the passenger seat and drove the rest of the way home, without the radio on, listening to the sound of the tires on the wet road. My attorney called 2 weeks later. A settlement had been proposed. Not the full amount of the original policy, but substantial. Enough to pay off the loans that should never have existed in the first place. I said yes. Not because the money was the point. Because my mother had worked to set it aside for me, and it was mine, and I wanted what was mine back. Around that same time, I was going through old boxes in my storage unit. The kind of task you put off for years, and then suddenly need to do at midnight on a Tuesday. Buried under a stack of nursing school textbooks I'd never donated, I found a card. My mother had given it to me the September before she died, right before I started my second year of school. On the front was a picture of a sunrise over water, the kind of card you find in a drugstore rack between the birthday cards and the sympathy cards. Inside, in her handwriting, you are the most capable person I know. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. And don't let them make you small. Not ever. Not for any reason. Not even to keep the peace. Especially not to keep the peace. I stood in the storage unit in my pajamas, reading those words until the light above me flickered. Then I carefully folded the card and put it in my coat pocket and brought it upstairs. It's on my kitchen table now, propped against the fruit bowl next to the coffee maker. I see it every morning. They called me difficult. They called me the one who couldn't let go. They called me ungrateful, which was the one that was supposed to sting the most, I think. The idea that everything they'd given me hadn't been enough. But here's the thing about that word. It's a weapon people use when they're afraid you've finally seen clearly. When they know the accounting doesn't add up in their favor. I'm not ungrateful. I'm the most grateful person I know. Grateful for the woman who kept a file box in her study for 12 years because she believed I'd eventually need it. Grateful for the colleague who comes for dinner and makes me laugh. Grateful for a neighbor's teenager who ate 3 bowls of soup and asked what it was like to be a nurse and actually listened to the answer. Grateful for a small apartment that is entirely, completely mine. Grateful, most of all, for the card in my coat pocket. For the woman who wrote it. I spent years trying to earn a seat at a table that had been built for other people. I showed up on time, kept my face neutral through 100 small cruelties, told myself it was family and family was complicated. I convinced myself that staying was love. It wasn't. It was just habit, and habits can be broken. Here's what I know now, standing on the other side of all of it. Peace is not something you are given by people who have spent years withholding it. You have to stop waiting for the room to make space for you and simply go somewhere else. Somewhere built for you, or somewhere you build yourself. Either one works. You are allowed to stop performing gratitude for things that were never actually given to you. You are allowed to take the truth your mother left behind and do something with it. You are allowed to sit around a too big table in a too small apartment with people who see you, really see you, and feel, for the first time in your life, like you are exactly where you are supposed to be. If any part of this sounds familiar, if you've sat through a toast that was about you without being for you, if you've watched yourself get edited out of someone else's version of history, I want you to know, you are not imagining it, and staying quiet is not keeping the peace. It is just postponing the cost. I know, because I paid it either way. The only difference was who held the receipt.